Hi. This is a jacket that I purchased about 10 years ago. I pretty much wear it every day and always thought it would probably be a good idea to trace it. So follow along if you want to see how I replicated this jacket. But first, some bonus cat content. This is Toby in his flowery collar. I'm using tracing paper and the grid on my cutting board as a guide. I'm also using a pin to mark armholes and necklines. I will say this works better if you're using standard pattern paper or even a roll of craft paper, but I make it work by scratching up the surface a bit and I can vaguely see the marks and feel it out with my fingers. Tracing a garment can at times be a tricky business. If you're just getting into it, I find that it's helpful to start out with something that has a loose silhouette or even something that stretches, which is typically a lot more forgiving. One other thing that I find super helpful when tracing is to measure the pattern that you've made and the actual garment, just to make sure those numbers are the same. Even with this project, I actually ran into a few discrepancies where some of the seams that I had traced weren't matching up to the jacket. It did take a bit of time to correct, but fixing this on paper is always better than catching the mistake after you've already started sewing. The fabric that I'm using is this boiled wool from Blackbird Fabrics. This was a pretty spontaneous purchase, and it's been sitting in my stash for a little while now, so I'm excited to finally use it. Sewing boiled wool has some fun elements. Since it doesn't fray, you can sew overlapping seams, which helps the seams to not get too bulky, and in some ways makes for a quicker project. To sew an overlapping seam, you mark the seam allowance on the piece that lays on top, and mark double the seam allowance on the piece that will go on the bottom. When you pin, line up the edge of the top piece to the line on the bottom piece and sew along the line. When sewing with boiled wool, make sure to switch to a walking foot and a ballpoint needle. To finish off the seam, trim off the excess on both right and wrong side. Here, I'm marking the seam allowances on the armhole and sleeve. I like to pin the middle and the sides first, and then everything in between, distributing the fabric as needed. I chose to do a single line of stitching, but you can also do two depending on your preference. I'm sewing sleeve in first, which makes the next step just a little finicky, but what you'll do is pin as usual and carefully turn the sleeve inside out. When you sew, you'll have to bunch up the fabric as you go to make a little tunnel. Once you make it to the end of the sleeve, you can turn the garment right side out and finish off the side seam. I'm folding the sleeves up 1.5 inches and sewing it down, leaving an opening to feed the elastic through with a safety pin. Don't forget to pin the tail end of the elastic so it doesn't get lost inside the seam. At this point, I realized I wanted to add a back facing, which the original jacket didn't have. I did this by tracing the neckline of the back bodice piece and making the shoulder line the same width as the front facing. And then I eyeballed the bottom curve. This is also when I cut out the collar because I was undecided about what type of collar I wanted. But I decided to stick to the original style of the jacket. For the undercollar, I trimmed off about 1/8 inch from all 4 sides. This will help the collar lay nicely and prevent the corners from flipping upwards. Just make sure to pull the undercollar so the edges line up with the top piece when you sew. Since this is wool, there's no need to turn the collar right side out. We're sewing wrong sides together and trimming off the excess from the 3 outer sides. To attach the collar, sew wrong sides together and then lay the facing over top and send it through the machine again. Before you can stitch the edge of the facing down, hem the bottom edge first, same as the sleeve. And then I like to try on the jacket to figure out the length of elastic. So pull an extra long piece through and then adjust as needed. Once the elastic is in, you can go ahead and finish off the front edge and sew down and around the facing, which will cover the opening for the elastic. Another feature that the original jacket didn't have were pockets, which I definitely wanted. Because I'm doing a pretty simple patch pocket, I waited until the jacket was pretty much done so I could try it on to see how big I wanted to make them. Although hand-stitched buttonholes are enticing, I went the easy route and luckily didn't have too much trouble sending the wool through my machine. And if you're using a seam ripper to cut open the buttonhole, work from the outside in so you don't rip the stitches. Sew on some buttons and a label. And here's how it turned out.